category. Bad.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you felt very welcomed by Beyonce. People I know are still bummed that she did not win Album of the Year, but welcome back. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Young, the Executive Director of When We All Vote. Happy New Year. We have not seen you since I think we saw you a little earlier on this year in January, but we haven't seen you in a while. So I'm going to still say Happy New Year. Happy Black History Month. There is so much going on in the world. It's hard to believe that it's just we've just been in this year, for January and February. It feels like it's been literally 4 or 5 months already into the year because every day, every week is so long with all the things that happen. But we're so glad that you decide to spend your evening with us at When We All Vote and some of our closest friends. I see you guys very active in the chat. I'm currently at home in Atlanta, Georgia. My mom just had to have her knee replaced, so I had to be here to support and help her. But I want to know where everybody is joining us from. I see Texas. I've seen DC. I see, it looks like I see some alphas. I see Alabama. Please let us know where you're calling in from. I see Los Angeles, where I live now, because When We All Vote, we're a community, and we love to continue to build this community because at the end of the day, we are the ones that will help to create the changes in this country that we want to see. And it's because of the community that we build here and how we work together. So we have a wonderful evening in store for you. This is all about learning. This is all about making sure that you are staying informed and you know what's happening, not just on Capitol Hill, but in state houses all around this country, so that we are ensuring that we are moving the ball forward. I hope that you guys actually tuned in to President Biden's State of the Union address. It's incredibly important that we know what the federal government is doing or not doing on our behalf. I was really saddened and shocked to see how some of the people who represent you all on this call tonight, how they represented themselves and you with the little decorum that we did see. But everything counts. And being able to hear the president talk about democracy and how it was threatened, I'm here to tell you tonight, I know our panelists are as well, it's still threatened. We cannot let up just because we had great voter turnout in 2022, but we have to dig in even more, and there's so much more work to do. So tonight is about learning about what's coming up, what's happening when it comes to voting rights, what's happening in Congress, what are we seeing when it comes to potentially, more voter suppression around this country, and what are we putting in place to stand up against these things, and how are we going to organize going forward? So I hope that you have a pen and a pad and you take notes. I hope that you ask your questions. We want to hear and see your questions for sure. I just want to point out a couple of things, considering it is Black History Month, because we've made a lot of Black history this election cycle, with Wes Moore becoming the first African-American governor of Maryland, with Maxwell Frost, who is a Gen Zer, and he is Afro-Latino, going to Congress, big deal, along with Karen Bass, the former congresswoman who is now the first Black woman mayor of Los Angeles, California. So we're making history and strides each and every day. So don't let anybody ever tell you that voting doesn't matter, that progress isn't happening, because it is, little by little, and that's what really counts. So we have a great evening in store for you, and I don't want to take up all the time talking, but I want to make sure that you're following us on all of our platforms, you're signing up for our emails. I think if you're on here, you have, but text 3 friends and ask them to do the same, because this is a way that we stay connected and involved and do our civic engagement work our way in our own communities. But the first person I want to call up is my soror of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Yes, I have on red and white, so shout out to all the Deltas tonight. But Yvette Nicole Brown is an exceptional ambassador for When We All Vote. She's an Emmy-nominated actress, writer, producer, and host, best known for her roles on television shows Community, I know y'all watch that, The Mayor, Drake and Josh, The Odd Couple, Disney Plus, Big Shot, and Act Your Age. Yvette believes in philanthropy and civic engagement, and proudly sits on the national boards of a number of organizations, including Donors Choose, Emily's List, MPTF, NextGen, and SAG-AFTRA. And again, she has been an awesome ambassador for When We All Vote and has stepped up to represent Mrs. Obama on many occasions. And she is the first person I want to bring up to speak with you all tonight. So Yvette, turning it over to you in your pink and green room.
Thanks. Hey, everybody, and happy Black History Month. And to my wonderful Sora Stephanie, thank you for the introduction. It is such an honor to be a part of all the great work you're doing at When We All Vote. And on behalf of Michelle Obama, I wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight. Now, as we head into the new year, I wanted to quickly remind you of all the good that we accomplished last year. Now, we broke records for voter turnout and early voting. And get this, over 158 million people voted last year. We also saw the second highest turnout rate of young people for a midterm election in the past 30 years, and that was 27%. And When We All Vote hosted its first inaugural Culture of Democracy Summit in June, which I was so honored to be a part of. Now, this is what I want you to remember. There are no off years. There are elections happening this year, and next year will be the general election. So this is our time, everybody, to catch our breath, but also to dig in, pay attention, and learn what elected leaders are or are not doing on our behalf. And that's what this call is all about. So here's the great news tonight. You'll hear from the When We All Vote team and our special guests, including Marc Elias from Democracy Docket, Laura Rodriguez from the Center for American Progress, and Elizabeth Hira, who was the former U.S. House Election Counsel. Now, they will talk to you about the current state of voting rights in our country and in Congress, and what actions we all can take now for our democracy in order to stay informed. So listen up, stay engaged, and be active in this work with me and the team. And remember, again, there are no off years. Wherever you are, say it with me. There are no off years. Now, together, we can make a difference. So thank you for taking the first step tonight. And with that, let me turn it back to you, Stephanie, to kick things off. And thank you again. I'll see you all soon.
Thank you so much, Yvette. We love you. We appreciate you. And thanks so much for all you do with your own voice to lift up these issues. If you just joined us, I'm Stephanie Young, the Executive Director of When We All Vote. And the topic of our discussion tonight is You Voted, Now What? There's a lot to do, guys. So if you have not told us where you're from yet, please let us know in the chat. We want to know what states you're representing, what cities you're representing. If you are from a partnership or partner organization, please let us know what organization you're representing as well. Again, we are all about building community, and Yvette so graciously introduced our panelists, but I'm going to give you just a little bit more information on them. So Marc Elias, who you all should know and all should be following, is the founding partner of the Elias Law Group and founder of Democracy Docket, a leading platform for advocacy and information on voting rights, elections, redistricting, and democracy. Big deal. Marc is nationally recognized or a nationally recognized authority and expert in campaign finance, voting rights, redistricting law, and litigation. And he's always taking people to court. That's why we love Marc, because he's real. He's real about it. He just doesn't talk about fighting voter suppression. He is in the courts fighting voter suppression. Elizabeth Hira, who's been a great friend of When We All Vote, is a social justice attorney who worked in Congress developing federal policy on equity, first on then Senator Kamala, well, now Vice President Harris's team, and later on the U.S. Committee on the House Administration, helping to generate the original For the People Act. We've talked about that a lot last year and the year before that. And Mother Jones called that bill the most significant democracy reform bill introduced in Congress since the Watergate era. Sad that it's just now here, but big deal. She's a big deal. And we are still supporting and fighting for that. And then last but not least, Laura Rodriguez is the Vice President for Government Affairs at the Center for American Progress. Most recently, she was the Chief of Staff for her hometown Congresswoman, Debbie Powell in Florida, where she utilized her broad Capitol Hill experience, and her knowledge of politics in the Miami-Dade area and Monroe counties. Everybody knows about Miami-Dade, right? It's always up for grabs, Monroe County, to help build the Congresswoman's bold legislative agenda. Anyway, we have a panel of experts, guys. These people are the cream of the crop. They are the ones that can help us break down what's happening and give us some insider information so that we better understand what's going on and we can talk to our friends and our family. I'd love to bring them up on stage if they are not already here. And I want to get into our first question. Again, please let us know your questions in the chat. But Laura, I would like to toss the first question to you. I hope that you can see me and hear me. I'm just making sure you can.
I can.
Okay, great. All right, so Laura, can we talk a little bit about what's going on in Congress? I think everybody saw the melee, the confusion, the embarrassment of the number of times that members of Congress had to vote for the Speaker of the House. And that has not happened in pretty much, I don't know, almost 100 years, I think. Something incredibly embarrassing. So we saw all that go down. It was mass confusion. But could you talk to us a little bit about what has changed in Congress as a result of the concessions that the current Speaker McCarthy has made, and what is the state of federal voting rights legislation under this new Congress from your perspective?
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for inviting me and for all the work that you and your team do at When We All Vote. It's so important. As you and Yvette said, there is no off year. So we got to keep moving forward. So just thank you for having me here to talk about this. So what is Congress doing right now? And what does it look like right now? Well, they're not doing much. What we're seeing is continued chaos in the House, which, it started with the Speaker vote, but it has continued. There's really very little substance happening on the House side. We've seen, the hearings and some floor votes, all messaging bills, nothing to help the American people. And that is a direct result of some of the concessions that Speaker McCarthy made. So, for example, the motion to vacate with one vote, right, which was something that he had to give in order to win his votes for speakership. That means if he comes off of like he gets out of line just a little bit, they're going to, any one of these folks on the extreme right are going to go ahead and call for a vote to vacate the speakership. That puts him in the tiniest of boxes. So is a historic weakening of the speaker's position. We also saw—
Sorry, just to jump in, just to break that down a little bit, when you say vacate, sure, for those who might not know, that means that they can essentially say you're no longer the speaker, right?
Well, they can call for a vote, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Correct. Yes, thank you. And apologies. Yes, I'm so used to talking up here in DC. But yes, DC speak, and all that to say, yes, any one member can go ahead and say, we want to call a vote and kind of yank you back from the speaker position. So again, he just cannot get out of line. He can't get away from his right flank. Incredibly dangerous. He also had to put some of the most extreme members of his wing, of his party, into real positions of power. We're talking about the Rules Committee, the Oversight Committee. The Rules Committee decides what gets on the floor, how it gets voted on, whether there are amendments, whether it goes on suspension. Just so you know what suspension means, when something goes on suspension, that means you don't have to debate it. You don't have to, there are no amendments made. You just, if you can get 2/3 of the House to vote on it, it goes with, kind of non-controversial bills. But the House decides, the House Rules Committee, decides where to put all of these things and how they are going to move through the House. And on the Senate side, we've got an incredibly slow start. I mean, McConnell just finished, I don't even know if he's done naming the members for the committees on the Senate side and the Republican side. So we are talking about a turtle's pace there. What does this mean for voting rights legislation? Unfortunately, it looks like it's not on the federal side. It's very much in trouble for this Congress.
Yeah.
We don't have a House that's is willing to negotiate on these issues. And so we're looking at, we got the Electoral Count Act passed in the omnibus late last year, which was the bare minimum, right? It clarified the vice president's role. It clarified some timing on certifying elections in states. But we've got a lot of states, and this is something I know that my fellow panelist Marc is can speak to, all day. But we've got a lot of states right now that are attacking the right to vote, how to vote, when to vote, and they're very targeted in those attacks, very targeted in which communities they want to affect. So, with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll leave that kind of framing.
No, that's really helpful. And it kind of leads to my next question to Elizabeth, considering your involvement in creating and crafting the For the People Act. Can you just remind our audience, what was in that bill along with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? I just saw a question in the chat about that status, but clearly we know that, those things aren't really, really going to go, unfortunately, anywhere right now. But what were the learning and some of the lessons from that experience of kind of building that bill? And what are you hoping for, and what do you see potentially going forward, considering you did also work on Capitol Hill as well?
I am so thrilled to be here with you guys. And Laura, I deeply feel all of the things you're saying. I come from one of those families. If you guys have heard me, I have a very vocal Caribbean mother who loves being like, what are you guys doing? And I'm like, this is what we're all up to, Mom. So I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here tonight to answer that question. And while Laura is right about the current state of the House that we are facing, that is going to make some of this stuff an uphill battle, what I always try to remind people is that what is amazing and was sort of unprecedented in history is we have put together over the last several years a package that is ready to go in the United States Congress when we have pro-democratic forces that are ready to pass it. And that is the drumbeat that I need all of us to keep up. And when when you need my hope of optimism note, I'll share with you about why I actually am optimistic about this. But I think for now, I just want to remind you, in the midst of all of this sort of the usual intransigence of Congress, that there is a piece, like a block of paper ready to go with all of these reforms that literally are fixing comprehensively some of the worst things that we've seen in our democracy. So I'm going to quickly remind you of some of the main tenets of what became the Freedom to Vote Act that are going to be transformative for American democracy. That includes really simple but really comprehensive stuff like automatic voter registration at the DMV, same-day voter registration, which would dramatically increase participation by young people and people of color, 2 weeks of early voting, including before work, like when folks are actually able to go to the polls, and things like that really matter for especially working folks. An election day holiday, which everybody just agrees is common sense. It actually did wonderful things like include young people in the vote by pre-registering them when they're 16 and 17, so they're automatically on the rolls when they turn 18 years old. It protects vote by mail without excuse and protects ballot drop boxes and access for voters with disability. Restores the right to vote to formerly incarcerated people who are living in their community, and protects against interference with voter registration, protects against election subversion by providing protections for poll workers, and prohibits voter intimidation. And again, literally soup to nuts of the worst stuff you heard. It banned these movements to try to stop people from handing out water at the polls, as small as that, and all the way down to, again, like massive stuff like banning partisan gerrymandering and creating for the first time clear neutral standards for congressional redistricting. And anybody who's heard me talk knows that I have become a true believer on this one part of the bill that actually would create opt-in voluntary small dollar public financing. I know that is a very big sentence. What it means is that Congress doesn't currently reflect us. If we help make it so that not only rich people can run, policies that we all care about finally get to the table. That is all the stuff that was in the Freedom to Vote Act, even in its most recent iteration. And Steph, I want to make sure I get to your question about what happened. I'll share the longer version of this later, but what happened is we put together that package in a moment that we did not think it had hope of passing. But the beautiful thing about momentum and the power of citizen advocacy is it went from a thing that was not a messaging bill, and I'm very careful about this, it was not a messaging bill, it was a comprehensive solution that didn't have the courage or the convictions of leaders at the moment to pass. You all made it within spitting distance of viability. And I think we need to remember that that was not a failure. That was another point on a trajectory that you have created incredible momentum behind. So that's what I want to talk to you more about. But I think that's where I want to leave you, is that solution is there and it's waiting for you and it's ready for you. And we need to make it so that we build leadership that actually is willing to take it across the finish line.
Absolutely. And right before I go to Marc, I just wanted to ask you about, there's a new bill that we've heard of, Vote at Home. I'm not sure, the Vote at Home Act. I'm not sure if you have any knowledge about that. And if that's like an offshoot of the For the People Act, if it's like a little piecemeal thing folks are trying to get towards the finish line. You underscored the point, though, that we honestly do have the power, because if we're in the streets, if we're protesting, if we're writing letters, if we're calling for still pushing for federal voting rights legislation, they have to listen to us at some point. So it's incredibly important that we stay together and active. But any response to that?
I think the answer here is yes, and I know that Laura mentioned recently the ECA, which was another bill that we were working on recently. I think we need to think about this. My best analogy is you wouldn't spend all the money to renovate your house and do all the other pieces of the house and then say, oh, but you know what, we're just going to leave the front door off the hinges because we're not going to worry about that right now. A functional democracy needs to be comprehensively fixed. And so I think all of these pieces are part and parcel and should not be traded away. And exactly as you said, Steph, these things only happen because we demand them. We made them possible. You made them possible through the work that you're doing. And you're doing the long game right now to get this stuff ready. So I think yes, and for the things that folks are asking you to support, but remember that public servants serve you. So you tell them what your priorities are and they need to follow you from there.
Absolutely. Marc, I would love your thoughts too on what's happening in Congress now, but I also would love for you to give our audience a little bit more insight as to what's happening around the country in places like Ohio. And, we're hearing that state in the news for what they're doing with voter ID laws and other things, but just what we should look at on the horizon that's coming down the pike in this space. Oh, you're muted.
So first of all, I want to join the chorus in thanking you, Stephanie, for having this, and what a wonderful organization you run. And you are an inspiration personally. We didn't get to hear your bio, but it is truly amazing. You're the only criticism I have for you is that as a native New Yorker, Hakeem Jeffries first.
Oh my God, yes.
Right?
Yes. And I was the communications director for the Congressional Black Caucus. So I feel
so just saying, since you called out like every other state, we in New York are here.
Yes,
and we're very proud of the leadership that we now have as both the Democratic leader of the House and the Senate Majority Leader are both from the great state of New York. So with that, I said this earlier on Nicole Wallace's show that we can't give up on federal legislation, but we also can't give an excuse to people in the states to not do what they can do, right? It's not enough to say, why can't Congress solve it? The question is, why can't the states solve it too? And right now, there are more trifectas in which there are pro-voting coalitions than there have been in 30 years. And so we need to focus on the Ohios of the world that are passing new voter suppression laws, which they are. We need to focus on Idaho, which is about to target student voting. We need to focus on the new bad laws that we're going to see in Florida, that we're going to see in what's going on in Mississippi now, where they're essentially gerrymandering out community courts and community prosecutors out of the majority Black city of Jackson. Right. So we need to focus on those bad states and worry about that. But I want to deliver a slightly modified message, which is, what are the other states doing? New York still bans food and water to people in line. That's a shame. They should fix that. We still have a problem in state after state after state where our friends and allies are in place and they could do better. And what I told Nicole Wallace today is, you tell me a state and I'll tell you how they can do better. So we need to make sure that as we are putting pressure and we are speaking out, we are speaking to our friends and we're speaking to the people who are not our friends. And when we do that, we will raise the bar for what voting rights is across the country, because the truth is we continue to have an epidemic of discrimination in voting. I mean, the fact is that, I saw some folks in the chat talking about Washington State. Black voters in Washington State have their ballots rejected 4 times the rate of white voters. Black voters wait in line overwhelmingly longer than white voters in almost every state. The system of voting in this country benefits old voters over young, white voters over Black, and that is a systemic problem that we need to tackle root and branch. So I'm happy that I'm suing Arkansas and Georgia and Texas and Kansas and Florida, but I'm also happy that I'm suing New York and trying to think of another Democratic controlled state, but we are suing across the board to try to make voting easier for everyone, whether you vote for one party or the other, whether you support one set of policies or another. Everyone should be allowed to participate on equal terms in our democracy. And that is something that, whether Congress takes that seriously and whether Congress is going to do the right thing, we cannot let up on the state and local officials to do the right thing. And when they don't, we need to be prepared to turn to the courts and insist, not ask, insist that the courts stand up to protect fundamental rights, which is the reason we have courts. It is there, they are there to make sure that fundamental rights are protected. And there is no more fundamental right than the right to vote in our society. So I think we need to be happy warriors. We need to be happy to bring our friends along, but we also need to be non-compromising in the fight for democracy.
Absolutely non-compromising. And we have so many comments about how wonderful you are, Marc, in the chat, and a lot of questions about supporting your work. So I'd love to come back to that in a moment and kind of expound upon, not letting up, right? And not letting up on federal legislation. So Laura, I want to toss this to you, considering your background and what would you say? And we do a lot at When We All Vote when it comes to advocacy. And I see a lot of folks in the chat talking about the advocacy work that they've done on behalf of legislation and things that they want to see move forward. But what are the ways in which our audience can consistently, besides just working through us, put pressure, on Congress and even, on their state representatives to take action on this issue?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. It's so important, and it's going to sound really cheesy, but this is the truth after working on the Hill for a very long time. Members of Congress log every call, every email, every visit. And it's real. And when things start to pile up, the pressure starts to build. They feel that pressure. You combine that with press, which some of us in the organizing world can do and continue to do and try to do when there's momentum. That incredibly powerful motivator. Something that Elizabeth mentioned about the momentum that happened in the summer of 20 or 21. Anyway, when we were very close to passing comprehensive voting rights legislation, Manchin had put out his kind of version of voting rights legislation, and we were incredibly close. We couldn't get right past there because of the film. Brought state legislators from across the country to come talk to members. We were a hair away. From getting that over the line, because when the state legislators were also hearing from their constituents, that amplified for them the importance of having to do the work at the federal level. So when we can get that momentum moving, when we can get that pressure built up, and it depends on every single one of us doing it, making the call, sending the email, visiting when you're here in DC or in your district, go to their offices, lodge the visit, make sure you are talking to somebody there and telling them that you think this is absolutely the number one job of the member of Congress. That all builds pressure to do it. It feels unfair to ask more of everyone, but it's our job. We have to do it. It's the only way to move forward, really.
Yeah, and at When We All Vote, we're going to figure out ways in which we can continue to put, our foot on the pedal. I know there's a lot of other issues that we're facing in this country, but if we do not have a democracy, which we're consistently kind of teetering on the brink of, and our democracy is not fully fair, equal, all of those things, right? We still have a lot of work to do there so that we can get to all the other issues that we really care about. And speaking of, our democracy still being under threat, Elizabeth, just from your perspective, what do you think, as you look at the construct as it is right now, what the biggest threat is to our democracy? Besides, voting, obviously we know, right? And you can say that and expound upon that. But there's so many times where we talk about the Electoral College and the challenges with that. We always get questions about that. We always hear our supporters talk about the filibuster and the fact that that makes, obviously progressive more legislation more challenging to actually pass, and all of these different things. But what would you, from your perspective, say you see the biggest threat to be?
I'd say there is a whole industry of people who are paid to keep you despairing. And it is amazing to me because I understand, professionally, I call them inaccurate. And I think personally, I call them haters, because I actually look at what happens in the world when we don't listen to pundits and instead we organize. And I think there were all of these anti-democracy forces, regardless of your party. There are a lot of people on both sides who actually do believe in democracy. And we were told that we were in danger of losing our democracy to exactly those sorts of people. And what's crazy is that this is a positive feedback loop. The more that you make people feel like their votes don't matter, the more they're likely to not show up, which lets bad guys who want to destroy your democracy win. And it doesn't make any sense to me that there are all these people, and I sort of joke about it because I love how certain they are about how worthless all of the reforms that all of these incredible people on this call have been working on, what Laura and Marc are doing, and what my amazing team in Congress is doing. And they weren't there. And I know they weren't there because these folks were there, right? We were all communicating about this. And I think it's really important that you listen to the people who have been doing the work, which again is why I'm grateful that you're on this call, because you guys are doing the work. So I think the biggest threat that I see is the twofold inaccuracy that is supporting apathy because it's selling papers. And the flip side of that is the inability of maybe sometimes folks like us to be able to break through to tell you what it is you actually need to do. And I'm going to, obviously, if you're listening on this call, you are an ambassador for democracy to your community, to your families. You are a powerful individual. And you are that way, A, because I'm sure you're an awesome person if you're a fan of When We All Vote, but secondarily, because you understand that information is the most powerful weapon you have in this fight. And you taking this information makes you responsible, which is both a privilege and an obligation, to actually representing your community. And so I'm going to take the flip side of that threat. I'm not going to be part of the despair community, but I am going to remind you that what you can do, guess what? Today is February 9th of 2022. You have a 2-year runway to be running for office. And you don't, sorry, 23, you have this runway. Yeah, it's been a long 2020 for me, I'll tell you personally. But you have time now. You are planning now so that you don't fall into panic later. And I'm not telling you that I want you to run for the Senate and for the Congress and for the House. I also, if you want to see cops not kill people with impunity, I need you to run to be the district attorney. I need you to run to be the sheriff to protect people of color in your places. I need you to run to be an election worker so that you can make sure that truth is always prevailing. And I'm going to close out here with some facts that I think illustrate why we need to be on this trajectory toward continuing to get better. You all know I always do homework for When We All Vote. So I went to Pew and I checked the latest numbers. Happy to report the 118th resulted in the record-setting most diverse Congress in American history. It is 72% male. It is 75% white. It does not reflect America. And obviously, people of color are not a monolith. People of genders are not a monolith. The entire United States Senate right now has 3 women of color in it. You can fit them on a surfboard together. I just need you to hear that because I need you to hear what actually happens when you get people with different lived experiences at the table. And you guys know, this is actually, again, runs across both parties. Lucy McBath loses a child to gun violence and decides to join the United States Congress to change what that face looks like for us. She took Newt Gingrich's seat. The people in that area see both of those people as representing them. Isn't that the best inspiration to try? Same thing. Katie Porter, brilliant woman, Harvard educated. Do you guys know she is the first single mom to ever serve, single mom of little kids to ever serve in the Congress? And that's why she was fighting to make sure that we had childcare for people, or that 2018 was the first time a pediatrician came to Congress. And she's out there fighting in Washington for the ACA and for kids to have access to protect them against diabetes. We have an American Indian in the Senate for the first time in nearly 2 decades, right? On the Republican side as well. And you guys know my crowning achievement for any of this about why it matters to have real people in the Congress. Cori Bush is the only person I have ever seen talk about living in her car with her little babies. And Cori Bush is the only person who slept on the Capitol steps to stop them from evicting people during the pandemic. It matters when people have experience and come to the table. And I am pleading with you now, while you have the time, look at yourself and say, who am I waiting for? Because I'm waiting for you. My mom is waiting for you. This country is waiting for you. And I need you to tell your sisters and your brothers and all the people who believe in our democracy to please come do this with us, because we are the last line of defense. We are also our greatest hope. So that is what I think is both the biggest threat, but the biggest hope for the country that we're facing, Steph.
That is all of that and some, like ad snaps, everything that you said. I often say that, voter suppression manifests in a multitude of different ways, including in the mental through my vote doesn't matter. And that mental block can really stop a generation, a group of people from making their voices heard. And it's so incredibly important that our elected representatives actually reflect who we are, not just reflecting, our values, but also our lived experiences, because they cannot create policy or legislation that actually impacts us if they don't understand where we come from and who we are. So thank you for all of that. Oh, go ahead.
Just make one caveat, because I am not that guy that is like, here's all the rhetoric and none of the facts. I researched and put together a list of different groups that will help you run for office across the party spectrums, for queer people, for young people. I will drop it in the chat, and I'm pleading with you, please, to actually take me seriously, and please use the resources I'm about to share with you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And just for everyone's awareness, we are recording this. So if you missed any of it, there will be an opportunity to watch it a little later, and you can also share it. I saw some folks in the chat. I do want to get to people's questions that we've been pulling. But before I do that, I want to go to you, Marc, and kind of pose the same question to you. As you think about the biggest threats to democracy, you usually, or oftentimes, you're litigating for the future and what the future should and could be. And as you look ahead, not just what your hopes are, but like as you look at some of the biggest threats, what are you? I don't want to be, because Elizabeth was so positive, I don't want to be negative, but I also want to be realistic, because all the fights that we're facing in this country, when you look at issues such as, women's reproductive health, those fights have gone on for 50 years, right? And I think that we oftentimes think, okay, one and done. I voted for this person, everything should be fixed, right? Not the case. Or we all care about voting rights, get it done. And not the case. You have to stay on top of these issues year after year, and democracy has to be the same thing, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the biggest threats and challenges, and also what makes you hopeful.
Sure. So, just on the courts for a second, there are right now 2 critical cases that are pending before the Supreme Court. I've seen in the chat references to both of them. The first is out of North Carolina. It's Moore v. Harper, and full disclosure, my law firm represents Harper, who was willing to challenge the perverse partisan gerrymander that we saw in North Carolina. And we went to court and we won. And that case is now before the Supreme Court on what is referred to as the independent state legislature theory. It's not a doctrine, it's a theory. It's not a doctrine because no court has ever adopted it. This is a wish list idea that the Federalist Society has been peddling for 20 years, that somehow state courts are not free to strike down laws passed by legislatures that restrict voting rights. And it's a dangerous theory. It has no historical support, but we are waiting to see what the US Supreme Court says about that case. We'll likely have a ruling by the end of June. The other case, though, which gets less attention, but is really, really important and just as important, also a case that my firm litigated, is the Alabama redistricting case, which should be an easy case. It has to do with the application of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, that prevents minority vote dilution. It guarantees minority communities the ability to elect candidates of choice. And the test for this has been the same test for 40 years. And 2 Trump appointees and a Reagan appointee agreed that Alabama violated that test. That's right. It wasn't like a bunch of liberal judges, like 3 judges, one appointed by Ronald Reagan, 2 by Donald Trump, said Alabama denied Black voters an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of choice by having a second congressional district that was an opportunity district. And the Supreme Court has taken that case and has heard argument. And remember, Chief Justice Roberts promised us when he gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, not to worry, that Section 2 would continue to have vitality and strength and would protect minority voting rights throughout this country. And yet here we are, and that case has also been argued, and we are awaiting a decision. There are other cases in the queue. There's a very important case that the NAACP won recently in South Carolina that will go up to the Supreme Court, but we cannot let the courts off the hook. You know, to Elizabeth's point, it's almost exactly what I say about the courts. Like, every time I read someone who is undoubtedly well-intentioned on the left saying, oh, the Supreme Court's terrible and they're never going to rule in our favor, I say no. Like, we have a right to expect the judiciary to stand up for those Black voters in Alabama, to stand up for the voters who suffered grotesque districting in North Carolina, to stand up for those voters in South Carolina, and to stand up in every state around this country as voting lawsuits are brought. I'm right now litigating 48 cases in 17 states. And so if you think there is an off year for democracy, just think about that for a moment. And so this is where I want to echo Elizabeth's plea for, if not optimism, because sometimes that has a sense of like, that it's not moored to reality. Don't let the critics and the cynics win. The critics and the cynics want you to believe the courts can't do anything to protect voters. They want you to believe they won't do anything to protect voters. They want you to believe your elected representatives have abandoned you in the plight for voting rights. And don't let them off the hook. Don't let them off the hook by buying into that cynicism. We need to continue to be clear-eyed and realistic, but we also need to realize that every day, President Biden is appointing more and more judges to the federal bench, and those judges look more like America than we have ever seen appointed before. So please don't give up, and stay engaged and bring a sense of, as I said, happy warrior to this, because we are on the right side of history.
Stephanie, can I just follow up one quick
Sure.
thing? I know that we want to get to the questions definitely, but very much in line with what Mark was saying, and because I get very disheartening, feel government isn't doing anything, and
Laura,
it doesn't.
sorry, you're breaking up.
Voting. Yeah.
You're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if you want to.
Better now.
You're a little better now. Yeah.
Oh.
Try again. Uh-oh. Technology. This is one thing that we hope to do, is actually to start going into communities and having more in-person events, so that we're able to connect with you all where you are, and we're able to see each other, and now we can embrace and do all the things that we were not able to do during COVID. I'm so sorry, Laura.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if
I think I'm back.
Okay, try one more time. Let's see.
Okay. All right. Apologies about that. So what I was going to say is, it sometimes can feel like it's not working. Like you vote, and yes, you want to like vote for the right person and things should be fixed. But I want to put a finer point to it of real results that we're seeing, especially in the last 2 years, right? We have seen what it was to have Joe Biden in the White House, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act. We saw insulin being capped at $35 a month for seniors. We're seeing prescription drug prices that are going to be lowering. We saw the Respect for Marriage Act pass, the PACT Act, the first gun bill of any consequence in the last 30 years. So there is a long list of reasons why, yes, there's still a lot of work to do, but it matters so much that we vote in every single election and we continue to fight, because to Mark's point, we're on the right side of history and we're getting there, but it is a long path. We just have to keep at it, but we're seeing this. Some of these things are going to take longer, but some of these things we're seeing right now. And I think that we should be optimistic about what we're seeing. And we should see that these are the real results of voting for people who really represent us.
Absolutely. When we all vote, we want you to vote in each and every election. We're obviously a nonpartisan organization, but we know that voting in each and every election, no matter, I don't want to say it doesn't matter who you vote for, because it does. It absolutely matters who you vote for. And if you go into the voting booth and you have any type of privilege in this country, you have to think about other people. So it absolutely matters who you vote for. We just don't endorse candidates when we all vote. But quick rapid fire, and then I have just two quick questions. Since we're, again, this conversation is all about learning. I saw some folks in the chat said we need more than webinars. Absolutely. This is just to make sure that we understand what's going on, because we have to make sure that we're educated. But would love to, since this is about information gathering, sharing, quickly, each panelist just tell us where you get your news from, your number one news source besides Democracy Docket. Make sure you sign up for that. But Marc, do you want to just tell us the best news source you go to when you're trying to get real good information?
So you took the key one off the table, right? I hope everyone goes to
You
democracydocket.com. You
can
can see all these cases that I talked about. You can read opinion and commentary, get updates about what's going on. Look, I try to read as many different sources as possible. I read everything from the very mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, but I also read a lot of less traditional media on both, by the way, the left and the right, because I want to understand what it is that are causing people to feel the way they are, for good or bad, for happy or despair about democracy. So I may be a bad person to ask because I read so many news sources. So yeah.
That's helpful. Look, sign up for Democracy Docket. He breaks it all down consistently and holds Twitter Spaces every week, right? To talk about what you
And
guys
I
are
have a new podcast with an episode tomorrow coming out on the Supreme Court.
Amazing. Yeah, please make sure you're following Marc. Elizabeth and Laura, really quickly, best news sources for you.
So my number one go-to is NPR. I just like both on radio and reading. I'm like constantly listening and reading NPR. I find it just comforting to know that they're always kind of giving me the facts straight as they are. And to Marc's point, they're talking to everybody from all sides and in different parts of the country all the time. So I find that an excellent news source. For a little longer form, I do The Atlantic when you're kind of trying to do deep dives into certain issues. But definitely, I have to say NPR is my number one.
I joke that I'm common law married to NPR because it's literally always on in my house. I just want to quickly, Steph, it's okay to take 30 seconds, just repeat the list of the organizations I didn't get to read out because I do want to leave people with concrete resources. For all ideologies, if you want support running, She Should Run and the Campaign School at Yale. Most of mine were focused on women. That's how I ended up doing this research. For Republicans, the National Federation of Republican Women, Right Women Right Now, two different groups. For Democrats, Run for Something, specifically geared toward progressive millennials and Gen Zers, and also Emerge. The Victory Institute supports LGBTQ plus candidates and both nonpartisan for young people. Ignite, IGNITE, is college oriented, and Running Start starts with high school folks. For news sources, echo everything that was said, but I also subscribe to the National Review on email because I find it really helpful to see how they're framing their issues to their folks. And I also follow ProPublica, ProPublica, because they do a lot of really great data work that I think needs to be lifted up. And I follow people like Steph Curry on Twitter so that I can learn about what people actually are going to be moved by in our community. So Twitter is actually a really great news source for me.
Great. Twitter, NPR, public television. I would say the PBS NewsHour. I used to work there very, very long time ago. But all of these sources are great and excellent, and we want you all to stay informed. So whoever would like to take these two questions, and then we'll give some final remarks. But we got a question from Brother Derek Jackson about what the state of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was, and I feel like we kind of talked about that in the beginning, but if someone could just jump in and give us a little background and understanding on that. And then also someone asked about more explanation around the Electoral Act, which I think is important for folks to know about too. So I don't know who's able to take those two on for us.
Marc, I don't know if you wanted to do, you see, I know that you probably,
Sure. So ECA, the Electoral Count Act, is the revision to a very, very old law passed in the 19th century that fills the gap between what the Constitution says, which is that states need to choose electors, and the other thing the Constitution says, which is that the president gets sworn in on a date certain in January. So left in that gap of how you actually go about taking electors from states and moving them through the process falls largely to the Electoral Count Act. And so because this law was so old and was drafted in very vague ways, there were a lot of uncertainties left. There were a lot of uncertainties left in the law. And then Donald Trump sort of tried to exploit some of the uncertainties and some of the things that frankly weren't that uncertain. Like, for example, whether the vice president could simply disregard the electors slates that were sent to Congress. But the new law does some really important things. The first thing it does is it essentially says that the slate of electors that comes out of the popular vote, assuming a state has a popular vote to choose electors in the first instance, that is the slate that has to move forward, that there can't be essentially a retroactive slate that is appointed after the fact. The second is it says that Congress's role in judging the electoral slates is actually pretty narrow and pretty limited. They can't, it raises the threshold essentially for people, for the members of Congress to try to reject the slates of electors. They put in place some provisions that I felt very strongly about, and I think really make the bill very, very important. That make clear that the courts have a role and a clear set out role to ensure that the right slate of electors wind up through this process. So it sort of strengthens the roles of the courts. It limits to some extent the role of Congress and makes clear the vice president has only a ceremonial role, and and hopefully in doing that will prevent another situation, at least part of the situation that we saw in the post-election of 2020, though, as Laura and Elizabeth said, this is not a replacement for the Freedom to Vote Act, the For the People Act, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Like it is solving a problem, and I don't want to minimize that problem, but it is not solving the problem facing democracy of discrimination in voting, of voter suppression, and even, frankly, a lot of the election subversion that Elizabeth laid out about harassing people at the polls, about intimidating poll workers. So there's a lot more work to be done, but it was an important bill.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. And this is why we wanted to have this conversation and want to continue these conversations, because oftentimes, people can be intimidated by what's happening because we don't know and always understand, and the sources aren't always as easy to digest. But it's important that we do understand these things, because sometimes people can say, "Oh, we've done something on democracy. Take a look at this. It's not enough." Anybody, Elizabeth, Laura, do you guys want to jump on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or do we feel like that issue is clear before we wrap?
I can talk about it at a very high level. Elizabeth hit, I think, on some of the pieces when she was talking about the For the People Act, but I think it gives a minimum requirement for how states conduct federal elections. In there was also expanded voter registration, requirements for minimum number of days and hours for early voting, and a nationwide right to vote by mail. Those are just, again, some of the kind of high notes that were included in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But I don't know if anyone has any more, if Elizabeth or you or Mark have any more detail, but those are kind of the high level things that are included in that bill.
I think
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
No, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say that I mentioned the case, the Milligan case pending before the Supreme Court. The Congress made a decision in 1965 to enact a law that was well past due as a down payment, a small down payment to ensure voting access and voting rights for minority voters, particularly Black voters who had been entirely disenfranchised in the Jim Crow South. It wasn't intended to be the end, it was intended to be the beginning. In 2013, the Supreme Court decided that a key portion of that bill, a portion of the bill that said that if you are a state or a county with a history, a proven history of discriminating against voters intentionally based on their color of their skin or the language they speak, then you lose the privilege to pass new election laws without those new changes being subject to review, what was referred to as pre-clearance, by either the Department of Justice or by a federal court. The Supreme Court of the United States decided that that regime, which had protected Black voting rights in the South and Hispanic and Native American voting rights throughout this country, had decided that that was no longer necessary. They did it based on their experience. Their experiences as privileged people who live behind concrete barricades and are barely able to go to the grocery store by themselves. They had decided these protections were not needed anymore. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would have gone a long way towards strengthening and putting back in place those protections and expanding them some. So when I say that it is, yes, the North Carolina Independent State Legislature case is important, but don't forget the case in Alabama. I mean, don't forget the case in Alabama, because the Supreme Court is now looking at the last big piece of the Voting Rights Act. It is a piece that even in the betrayal of the civil rights movement in 2013 in the Shelby County decision, that the Supreme Court promised would remain vital and remain a powerful tool against racial discrimination in voting from coast to coast, from north to south. And if the Supreme Court now backs away on that, then they will have completely eviscerated these protections. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would have been a critical part. The assault on voting rights continues, and particularly the assault on minority voting rights. And so I just want to say that not only is it an absolute stain on the Congress that they did not pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and a stain on the Supreme Court that it was necessary, but it will be a stain on all of us if we allow the last pieces of this landmark legislation that was signed by a Southern president from Texas 50 years ago, and we haven't been able to do better than that since. If we let this last piece go, then it will be a very dark day in our country. So I hope everyone pays attention to that case. I hope everyone keeps pushing for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I hope people hold states accountable to pass state level laws. There are states that have now passed state Voting Rights Act laws. And, you know, I think that is why we need to continue the fight for full voting rights legislation in Congress and in state houses around the country.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Alyssa.
Like, it's just important to add that part of Shelby County's justification was that racism was over. And what's amazing about the result of Shelby County is that we saw an incredible slew of basically laws that we know directly impacted people's of color's ability to vote. And I want to keep sharing resources with you that make very clear that you have data to back these claims up when you make them. My old employer, the Brennan Center, who I adore, just put out this amazing report linking voter suppression work to race. And what we actually see is the place representatives from the whitest districts in the most racially diverse states are the most likely to sponsor anti-voting bills. So it's fear and it's a lack of exposure to real communities that is motivating a lot of this. And that's where, again, that advocacy work and that speaking to your community makes such a big difference. So the Freedom to Vote Act and the VRA need to move together, and we can make that possible in the coming cycle.
Absolutely. And in addition to fear, it's also the recognition of the power that voting has in this country, and the power that voting has in any strong democracy. So we have our work cut out for us. This is just the first of many conversations that we will be having during this non-off year. We look forward to creating more opportunities for you to learn about what's happening and how you can become involved. And this is about us building community. So I really hope that everyone enjoyed tonight. I want to thank each one of our panelists. I want to thank our wonderful team at When We All Vote for pulling this together, from Amanda to Arisa, to Yala, and in addition to that, there's and Valentina and all her help and support in making this happen, because this is our time to make sure that we are staying fit. We're still doing our cardio, getting ready for the race that we're going to have to run in 2024, and we need each and every one of you with us. So sign up for our emails. Make sure you're following us on all platforms. We've also broken down that Supreme Court case in Alabama in a beautiful slide that our digital team put together. So make sure you check that out. Maybe we can put that in our stories tonight so you can take a look at that, so that you are more educated on that as well. And you're paying attention, as Mark said. So Mrs. Obama thanks you. We thank you. Don't lose hope. This is only the beginning, and we cannot wait to continue this work together. We'll have an event in about 2 more weeks, or about a week and a half. So keep a lookout, an eye out for what it will be, and ways that you can join us as we have a Black History Month event very soon. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Be safe, and let's keep up the fight. Thanks, guys.